Thinking about Rumour and thinking about Sweet Smell of Success, I mean, tell me a little bit about the circumstances you first saw Sweet Smell of Success. You'd have been, it was 57, so you'd have been in your 20s then?
25.
Right, okay.
So first of all, I was brought up in a small provincial town, Salisbury. I was working I was qualifying as a chartered accountant. I didn't want to be doing this job particularly, but my parents had asked me to do it. So my life was kind of mundane. So the cinema became a wonderful escape route for me. We had 3 cinemas in Salisbury, the Regal, the ABC, and the Gaumont. The Gaumont had a suit of armour in the foyer. It was a mock Tudor cinema. So you had about 8 films a week, because on Sundays you had different films, you had double bills and so on and so on. Anyway, most of the films were pretty well all English-speaking films, you know, American and British films. And they were mostly entertainment films. I saw one foreign film the whole time of my 10 years of being able to go to the cinema at Salisbury, and that was A Girl in Black by Michael Kakianis. Anyway, so I tended to go and I saw all the musicals. I loved Doris Day and so on. Anyway, so I went to see. Another important element of this story is that Picture Go, which was the kind of pin-up magazine plus cinema, was with a very good critic called Margaret Hinksman, I seem to remember, and she put me onto a whole load of really terrific films. And I was lucky because the English cinema in those days, English-speaking cinema, was at a peak. You had Billy Wilder, you had the most, you know, Powell and Pressburger. Anyway, I remember going in and seeing Sweet Smell of Success and being utterly shaken. Now, my knowledge of the cinema was limited. I mean, I just saw the films and I relished them. And I didn't even know that the person who made it seemed so unlikely. It had made the Maggie, it had made, you know, the Ealing comedies that he made, that he was a Scotsman. I had absolutely no idea. It took me about a decade before I realized that a Scotsman, a British director, had made this film. It seemed so incredibly unlikely. And of course, we had gossip columnists here, but they were nowhere near as powerful as the ones in America, like Walter Winchell and all the other ones there. So it made an immense impact on me. And the way that it was directed and acted and everything about it, I just loved.
I was going to ask whether you had any knowledge of New York before, because the thing about Sweet Smell of Success is even now, I mean, it's one of those definitive New York movies, and so many of our ideas collectively in Britain, I think perhaps more than anywhere, about New York are taken from this movie. Sure. I mean, when did you first go to New York after that? And did Sweet Smell ring around in your memory when you were
well, it's always, when you first, well, it actually still is, in a sense. When you go to New York, you always think you're in a film. So I went there in 67. No, 64, sorry, I was on World in Action, and I was sent there to do a film which fell through, and then they sent me, and I went and did a profile on Barry Goldwater Jr., and I went to Dallas, and I filmed the Republican Convention in Dallas in 1964, a year after Kennedy's assassination. And in the whole of the Republican Convention at that time, I remember there was one black person in the whole of this convention. And I learned something very important there, actually, because Goldwater didn't want anything to do with me. One, I had a beard, which in those days was pretty rare in America. And secondly, he assumed that I was BBC and therefore a communist. What he didn't know is that I was working for Granada. So when I said that we were working for commercial television, they were all around. You have commercial television. God, you're with us. I never let on that the Bernsteins who owned Granada were millionaire socialists. I never let on about that, actually. So that was my first trip to New York, but it was like being in a film, and it still is to a large degree.
There's that particular, I mean, because for those people who haven't seen the film, I mean, most of it takes place, there's a particular section of kind of Midtown, really, around Times Square, and there's an energy, I don't know whether it's particularly good energy, but there's an energy that you have around that part of New York.
Sure,
I don't
no,
think
absolutely.
you have anywhere else.
Sure.
And there's those films, I mean, things like Taxi Driver, you think, I mean,
Sure.
so much of the imagery is drawn, again, straight from Sweet Smell of Success.
Sure,
really.
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, people are better informed than me about the making of the film, but I think I've heard that MacKendrick had quite a tough time making it. Maybe you know more.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. I mean, I don't think MacKendrick was the first choice to actually make the film, and I think pretty much the casting.
Very unlikely choice too.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think at that point, Ealing had been sold, or was in the process of being sold to the BBC, funnily enough, and so I think MacKendrick took that as his cue to leave, essentially, because he thought, well, I'll be washed up. I mean, Ealing will just be folded into the BBC, and this isn't something I want to do. So he travelled across, and I think he had American family, so he sort of, in a sense, he was going home. But it was a very fraught process, Sweet Smell of Success. It's interesting, for people when they're watching the film to think quite how fraught it was. I was going to ask whether you felt that came through in the atmosphere of the film, because you had Tony Curtis was advised very strongly not to do the film because his managers and his agents felt it would ruin him.
And he was a pretty boy in those days, really.
Absolutely, and the character Sidney Falco is anything but. I mean, he's a pretty boy. They refer to that in the script, but he's a pretty boy with a very black heart. And then, of course, Clifford Odets was brought in because it's Ernest Lerman. It was adapted from his novel, wasn't it? Ernest Lerman. And Ernest Lerman was brought in to write the script, and at first he was going to direct as well. Then Ernest Lerman, because of studio politics, was pushed out of the way. MacKendrick came on board, and then Clifford Odets, the great New York scriptwriter Clifford Odets, came on. But I think he was given 2 or 3 weeks to write the script, and of course carried on and on writing the script. So by the time they were shooting, they had no script. So it's interesting thinking about the way that was shot.
Where was the problem? In the editing, was it?
It was in the script. I mean, Odets didn't turn a script in.
Oh, right.
So you basically, and it's so interesting seeing the film because the film it seems so slick, and it's got that New York.
Yes, you'd never know there was friction at all. Actually.
But as a director, I'd be fascinated in your take on that, because the idea, I mean, they were certainly at first they were turning up on set, and Odets' assistants were bringing the scripts, bringing the new pages in that morning, and MacKendrick was they were having to make the best of it.
Right. Well, I think it's rather good to improvise like that. Actually, sometimes good things happen. I think when you're under, there's the sort of pressure of making the film. I mean, Carter was like that for me. I mean, I shot it on the seat of my pants, that film. I mean, I only had, from the moment I got the book, I was I got it in January, and I'd written the script, and I was shooting the film in July. I mean, and I shot it in 7 weeks on £750,000. So it was but interesting enough, I did a film in 1990 called Black Rainbow, another one of my major commercial successes, with Rosanna Arquette and Jason Robards and Tom Hulse. And I originally had approached Burt Lancaster to play the role of Rosanna's father. And I had long conversations with him, and he liked the script very much. And I'm glad, he sounded fairly terrifying, I must confess. But I'm glad that he turned it down, because Jason Robards was more appropriate. He's much gentler. I think of Burt Lancaster, who was wonderful. I think he's a wonderful actor. Would have been too powerful, I think, in the role, whereas Jason played a weak man much better.
And by that point as well, I mean, Burt Lancaster brought so much baggage, actually not least because of roles like Sweet Smell of Success. But again, he wasn't the first choice. I mean, in the end, it was Lancaster's production company who made the film, but he wasn't. I don't think MacKendrick wanted him. So there was this whole stew of accidents and rancor, even going into the film. I mean, I was going to ask if you'd had experiences like that. So it's interesting you mentioned that Get Carter. There was a similar sort of a sense of, I suppose, spontaneity, forced spontaneity. Well,
this is going from sublime to the ridiculous, but Flash Gordon was like that. I have no idea what I was asked to do, but Nick Rogue was going to make it, and then through a series of sort of weird circumstances, Dino De Laurentiis approached me to do it. And I don't think anybody, the production department, the design department, Danilo Donati, who's a wonderful production designer, did the costumes and everything, and who worked with Fellini. I don't think he ever read the script, frankly. So I learned very rapidly that the only way I could survive on this film was to walk on the set in the morning and say, what have we got here today? And then I'd make it up as I went along. And I think that if you like the film, then it's like a souffle, because I just had to just simply improvise on this film. And I think that's made it, well, now it's a sort of cult film, I gather. And it's because it is so light, and it's obviously, it was such fun. Once one got the hang of how to manipulate Dino De Laurentiis, and what I used to do was basically, because we had a terrible falling out to begin with, and he called for the list of directors. He had a line producer, had a list of directors. And he'd say, and there would be Nick Rogue at the top with a line through it. And he'd say, get this one. You see, and he pointed at me, and he said, no, he's just left the film. And he called me Nick for 3 months. He couldn't get the idea out of it. Anyway, I grew to love Dino very much, but what I used to do with Dino was about sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd say, Dino, I've got this idea, and I'd tell him the idea. Hey, Mike, I think about it, So the following morning, he'd come in and he'd say, "Hey, Mike," and he'd tell me my idea. And he'd say, and I said, "Dino, you're a genius." And we had this wonderful working relationship once I'd worked out. And there was another so the film was fun for me to make, and I think the film feels like fun if you see it. But there was another wonderful, in the middle of all the mayhem, I turned to Dino one day, sort of madness, and I said, "Dino, why on earth did you choose me to make this film? I'm the most unlikely director." As indeed MacKendrick was an unlikely director for Sweet Smell. And he said, and I thought he said, "Hey, Mike, I like Geta Carter, I like a Terminal Man, I like, you're a great filmmaker." So instead of which he told, "Hey, Mike, I like your face."
I'd go with that if that was
well,
me.
I know,
I'd
it was lovely.
I mean, that's fine. You know.
I loved it. Thank you very much.
You could have that as a motto for life. Dino Torrente likes my face. You know. I was wondering about dialogue. I wanted to speak to you about dialogue particularly because Sweet Smell of Success is one of those films where the first thing that comes to mind when people think of it is the dialogue. Yes. And again, you see that rippling through your career, I think. I mean, even in a movie like Flash Gordon, which is a spectacular, you know, there's always these little lines. And Get Carter, of course, is again famous for its dialogue. Was that something that you were doing consciously? Was it the dialogue of Sweet Smell of Success that had a huge impact on you and you knew that was something you wanted to take
Well, of course,
into your career?
the odd thing about it is, unlike today, in those days, you just saw a film once, you know. So the kind of the impression that it made on you was whilst it was fleeting, was all. And you have to remember also there were so many great films in the 50s and the early 50s in particular. Billy Wilder, my favourite probably of all time, and the dialogue was so often so crisp and so wonderful. It was almost impossible not to relish it, you know, and particularly in the American films, and the dialogue I always thought was just great, and the humour, so I think that, including this, I mean, the lines in here which are just, you're in for a treat in a minute when I get me out of the way, is that, you know, "Match Me Sydney" and all these great lines. I mean, it's a tremendously good script.